Okay, so we are finished with the insides of the jacket. Now we're ready to move on to the binding on the outside. To do the binding on the outside, it is so very similar to what we've already done. It's basically the same technique, except we just have one layer of this quilted fabric. So what you're going to do to begin with, you need to start with your front seams on the front. Cut a bias strip that is the length of that. You're going to stitch it in place with your 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now it's important at this point that you're doing everything, your beginning stitches from the right side of the fabric. When we were on the inside, it didn't really matter which was the right and the wrong side as far as where we did our first stitch and where we did our top stitch. But now that we're on the outside, we want to be sure that we're doing all of our top stitching from the top of the jacket just for consistency. And I think it's probably a little bit prettier stitch on the top. So go ahead and be sure that you're putting your right sides together as we're going forward with all of this. So all you do is stitch that down just like we've been doing. Wrap it around. Wrap your folded edge around to where it covers up your stitches there, and do your top stitching along here. And let's do this for both of your front seams, and then come back and we will go to the next step. Okay, so I have the bias binding done on each of the front edges of the jacket, and we're going to move to do the lower edge of the jacket. First thing to do is to go ahead and trim these ends of your bias at a very, very slight angle. Not super angled, just maybe just a little bit, because we're going to have a little bit of bulk up here as we put the next layer on. It's not anywhere close to a 45 degree, just a little bit of an angle right there on each of those edges. Now, remember at the very beginning, we joined 2 pieces of bias, and this is what I have here. So there is a seam right here in the middle, and this piece, we had to join it because there wasn't enough, because this was too long of a length to use just one strip of bias that I had. So what I like to do, although it is kind of hard to even tell where the seam is, I like to have that seam, of course, in an inconspicuous place. So I like to have it right here at the side seam where there already is another side seam. If you want to do it at the center back, that is fine. Really and truly, it's probably not ever going to be noticed by anyone anyway, but just because that's what I like to do, I'm going to put it right here at the side seam. So I'm going to pin that together, pin it right there to begin with the right sides together. Now my seam here in the back is pressed towards the back, so that's good. So once I have that pinned in place, I can go ahead and, just like we've done all these other seams, I'm going to open up this binding and I'm going to pin it all the way around. And I should have plenty of space, even though, let me measure and make sure, but I should have plenty of space. Yes, just barely, even though I didn't put the seam of the join in the very middle, but I do have just enough here. So we are going to pin this all the way around so that I can do my first stitching just like we've done on all of these bindings. The different thing on this one is that we are going to leave a tab at the end. We are not stitching this. We are going to stitch it. We're going to have about a 1/2 inch over the edge right here on each end that we are just going to have hanging off of the end. So pin this in place all the way around the whole thing, and then on both ends you should have about 1/4 to 1/2 inch. 1/4 is the smallest amount you could have, 1/4 to 1/2 inch hanging off the end here, and go ahead and stitch that first stitching and then come back and we will do the next step. So here's what we have. I've done the first stitching all the way across the bottom, just the single stitch all the way around. I should mention that I have not been zigzagging it since we are not sewing 2 layers together. So I've just been leaving it and it's been just fine. But now, we're getting close to doing this step where we wrap it all around, but what we need to do is finish this edge. And I had you leave an end of about 1/4 to 1/2 inch. What we're going to do is leave this first fold of the bias folded you know, the very first ironing that we did, but we're going to fold it back upon itself to where the two folded edges are right here together. You can see this is one folded edge and this is one down here that's been stitched down. So we're going to fold those right on top of each other. This is my raw edge here, and I have the right sides of my bias together. So I'm folding those together. I'm going to stick a pin in it here, and we are going to take this to the sewing machine, and I'm going to sew a stitch from here to here, right along the edge, the outer edge of this bias, but it's going to enclose the end of this bias here, and then we're going to trim it and turn it inside. So it's folded back up on itself with the folded edges together, stitching right here. I've already done that on this side. You can see it is, it's stitched, but it's not been pushed back inside. So what I'm going to do here is trim to about 1/8 of an inch. And then I can turn all these seams to where it's right inside. I'm going to use my little awl pointer to kind of gently push everything in there together. And now I have a nice point on here. This edge is all the way stitched, and I can go ahead and pin this down all the way around and stitch it, do the top stitching all the way around. Now I'm going to have to finish up this edge here first before I do that. So you do both ends, trim it, turn your corner, get a nice point, and then you can do your top stitching all the way around for that as well. Back here with the bottom binding all finished and with some nice corners on the end. Next, we're going to move to the neck. It's going to be exactly the same technique that we did on the bottom, including the corners. So we're going to have a strip of bias that's at least 1/4 to 1/2 inch longer on each end, extending past each end. I did press my bias into a curve to hopefully help it fit around this curve a little bit better. The only difference is in this is that you might want to slightly stretch the bias as you're stitching it on, just so that it will curve nicely and not get any little wrinkles in it. So I'm going to let you have at that and give it a try, and I'm going to go ahead and do mine, and when we come back we will work on the sleeves. So we're finished up with the neckband and ready to move on to the sleeve. Yet one more time, it's something that's very familiar that we've already done, but there's another little skill to learn, thing to learn, because on this very last bias binding that we're doing, we are going to have to do it in a circle. So what you need to do, first of all, is measure the circumference of your seam here. So I'm going to use just a little clip here to hold this in place and figure out exactly my circumference of this, and it is 8 3/4 inches for this one that I'm doing. Let's make sure I have that. Yeah, 8 3/4 inches. So what I'm going to do is add 1/2 inch to that measurement, so that would be 9 1/4, and I am going to cut my strip right at 9 1/4. And now I'm going to open it up, putting right sides together, and we are going to stitch this into a circle. So I'm going to stitch right across this line here. You know, we've put the short ends together, right sides together. Get a couple of pins in it here. And I'm going to stitch just right across this edge, forming a circle, and when I come back we will put it into the sleeve. So I have the circular bias band stitched. I have just finger pressed it open, the seam allowance open. I'm going to put that to the side and talk about one other little thing about sewing sleeves, the small end of a sleeve. It really is easier for me if I sew it from the inside. So whenever I take it to my machine, I have turned this sleeve, you can see the inside is out, and I'm going to do my stitching from this direction, which means that my presser foot is going, in my machine will be up here, but my presser foot is going to go along the inside of the seam as I sew, which is a whole lot easier to keep the rest of this fabric out of the way if I'm sewing from the inside than if I'm trying to sew like this from the top side. So that is why you turn your sleeve inside out and then put your bias band in that way. So I'm going to have right sides together. I'm going to put my my seam right here at the other seam of my sleeve. And I'm just going to begin to pin this in place all the way around. And it should fit in there just right. If it doesn't, you can make a little bit of an adjustment to your to that short end seam that you did, but if you'd measured, it should fit you just fine. I'm going to get all these little pins in here, and then we'll be able to just treat this just like we did with all the other bias seams that we've done. Like I said, there's just a little bit of a different technique to learn with each and every different place that we have done bindings. This is the last one to do like we've done. So now that I have my bias binding pinned in place, I'm going to take it and I'm going to sew the edge all the way around here. Then I will flip it to the outside, pin it down nicely, and then I'll stitch again the top stitching on the inside. And that should get me a good finished sleeve, and when it's done, it will look like this one. This one I have folded down here, but you can see that this is what your finished sleeve edge will look like, and then if you want, you can fold it up and see a little peek of the inside fabric out at that wrist area if you would like. So go ahead and work on this binding, and when we get done, it will be time for buttons and buttonholes, and we will be so close to the end. Okay, here we are ready to get started with buttons. For this particular jacket, I'm making covered buttons, and they are not a hard thing to do, but I am going to go over a little bit of information about that. You don't have to do covered buttons. You could do just a regular button, a shank button, or another type button if you would like, but what I have are covered buttons. So these are 5/8 inch. They're available at Children's Corner, just a covered button kit. The covered button kit comes with this little mold and a little pusher along with the pieces of the buttons. The covered button refill is what you would get if you already had a kit that had the pusher and the mold in it. So those are two things though that you need to have to make the buttons to start with. The instructions for doing it are on the back. There's also a little template. It's kind of hard to see, but there's a circular shape on the back right here that you need to cut out, and that's going to be your template for the size of the circle that you need to cut for your button. Most of the time, if it's a lightweight fabric, I like to interface it, which I've done here with this little piece. Sometimes you can actually see through the button, see through the fabric to the shiny part of the actual button if you don't have an interface. So if it's lightweight at all, I would go ahead and do that. But I've gone ahead, I have a circle that I cut out from a previous package, and you can see here I have just traced my 6 circles on there, and I've cut this one out. So I've got my mold and my pusher, and then, you know, there's this round part of the button, and then the shank. So you just center that, center your fabric over the mold, and then use that flat part of the button to push down in there, and you can see it's nice because it's clear and you can see through to see exactly how it looks. And then I usually just use my fingernails to push all of those edges down very tightly in here. And you may also find that you have other tools around that will help you get those pushed down really well. This is just the end of a big pencil, but you can actually look and see, I mean, check all those edges, make sure there aren't any little wrinkles in there around the edge and that it's, you know, relatively smooth. Now, covered buttons are, at times, it could be foreseeable that this outside of the button can pop off of the shank. So a lot of people will put just a little tiny drop of glue in there so that this will actually be glued together. So that is something to think about. But the next thing, which is really probably the most important thing that I wanted to say in this, is, you know, if you look at the back of it, it's just a little metal wire loop, and our buttons are horizontal. So it's going to be going this direction as it's buttoned in the jacket. But when you have something that's a little bit directional, which gingham is, you know, we have this direction, which the lines are straight across, or we have this direction where it's more a straight bias. But then there's also all different variations in between those things. So if you care which direction those lines go on your buttons and you want them all to be the same, you have to pay attention as you put the back of your button in so that you don't get all different turns and twists of your gingham fabric. So for this particular one, I am going to make my buttons on the bias, which is going to look like this. So my shank back here is going this direction. It's horizontal and flat because when you stitch your buttons in, these are horizontal buttonholes. So this is how it's going to be. So you just have to pay attention and make sure as you put your little shank in here that little wire is going the direction that you want it to go. And just stick it in there, and then you use your little pusher to put that end down in there, and you can just press it. I usually also will bang it with a hammer just to help really get it in there well. Sometimes they will get a little bit in there, a little bit crooked, but you can usually use a hammer just to bang it down in there a little bit, and then they pop out pretty easily. And now that I have it out, I think I'm going to bang it even a little bit more just to really secure that in there. Remember, I said you can even put a little drop of glue in there to keep this in place. But anyway, that's how it's going to look. So I did manage to get that where it's going to be pretty much diagonally the way the fabric is going to lie in the button. So you've got 6 to do, so you'll get a good bit of practice. 6 or 4 if you're making a tiny little jacket. So go ahead and make your covered buttons, and when you come back, we are going to talk about buttonhole placement, and that should be the very last thing. Okay, so here we are at the end talking about buttonhole placement. If you put the buttonholes at the places that it is marked on the pattern, they are going to be in this position right here. I've just put a little buttonhole on this little scrap piece, but the buttonholes are positioned 1/4 of an inch from the edge, which means that the end of the buttonhole is going to be right up here against your bias binding. And for one thing, that might be a little bit hard for some people to get just right with a buttonhole right next to it. The other issue is that with shank buttons, a lot of times your button is going to slide around a lot within the buttonhole because it's just this little wire back here. And really there could be trouble with that type thing with any kind of buttonhole. But we would like to think in a perfect world that our button would sit right there in the very middle of our buttonhole and look nice and pretty. But what really usually happens as something is being worn, especially a horizontal button, is that the button pulls over to the point of resistance. So this is what you get. So if we place our buttonholes right here at 1/4 of an inch from the edge, we're going to have buttons that are overlapping partially our bias. And that just doesn't look as nice as if, it's sitting a little bit more over here. So the way that we can fix that is we need to move our buttonhole over to where the end of it is more in this area so that when it does pull to that point of resistance, it still looks like it's here. So what we're going to do is I have my pattern piece here, and this is actually, I have not modified these yet, but you can see that this is just 1/4 of an inch from the edge. So what we're going to do is we are going to move all 6 of them over 1/4 of an inch so that there's actually 1/2 of an inch from the edge to the end of the buttonhole. So all of them are going to go this direction 1/4 of an inch away from the edge. The other thing is if we put a button right up here, probably would look nicer if we move them down about 1/8 of an inch. So since we're moving already, I'm going to say that we are going to move, move it over horizontally, but then we're also going to move it down vertically, just 1/8 of an inch. And that'll give us an entire button space where it doesn't look like our button is just sitting right there on top of the bias. So that is the last thing I need to say about buttonhole placement. You can go ahead and mark them, stitch them in place, stitch your buttons in place, and when you come back, we should all have a finished jacket, and we'll talk then. All done. All finished with this little jacket. All finished with all the bindings. I think it might be a little while before I try to do any more bindings on anything else. I don't know about y'all. But it was fun to learn something new, fun to do something different. We've done so many different types of bound seams here, all with the same technique, but definitely, we've had the straight and the curve, then we've had the outside curve, the outside straight, doing the corners, the little pivoting under the arms. There's been a lot of things, the sleeve, circle, but I have not even scratched the surface with what you can learn about doing this kind of technique. There is certainly so much information out there on the internet about bound seams, a lot of really lovely finishes where you finish it by hand rather than using your machine to top stitch. And I encourage you to look around some more and see what other things you can find for using this technique. And until then, I hope that you enjoy your little Tate jacket with quilted fabric. Bye-bye.